There's a kind of tiredness that sleep doesn't fix. It's not about your body. It's not about how many hours you slept last night or how much coffee you drank this morning. It's deeper than that. It's the tiredness that lives in your chest, in your thoughts, in the way you move through your day like you're walking through water. It's the exhaustion that comes from pretending, from performing, from living a life that doesn't quite feel like yours. It lingers even on good days, even when nothing is technically wrong. And if you've ever felt that, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You know the weight of waking up and realizing you have to do it all over again. You know the strange emptiness that comes with checking all the boxes, doing all the right things, and still feeling nothing. Or worse, feeling like you're disappearing, like your life is happening, but you're not fully inside it. This isn't laziness. It's not weakness. It's not something you can fix with a vacation or a motivational quote. This is emotional exhaustion, and it's one of the most misunderstood forms of suffering we experience as human beings. Because on the outside, you look functional, capable, responsible. No one sees the quiet strain of holding yourself together. Carl Rogers, one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century, spent his entire career trying to understand this quiet despair. Not the loud breakdowns, not the dramatic crises, but the slow, invisible collapse that happens when a person loses touch with who they really are, when the gap between who you are and who you've been trying to be becomes so wide that just existing feels like effort. And the worst part, most people don't even realize it's happening. You wake up one day and you're tired. Not tired of working, not tired of responsibilities, tired of pretending to care, tired of smiling when you don't mean it, tired of saying you're fine when you're not, tired of being the version of yourself that everyone else seems to need, tired of rehearsing your responses, tired of measuring every reaction. You start to feel like a stranger in your own life, like you're watching yourself from the outside, going through the motions, saying the things you're supposed to say, doing the things you're supposed to do, and somewhere deep inside, there's a voice asking, is this it? Is this all there is? That's the voice Rogers wanted us to listen to, because that voice, uncomfortable as it is the only honest thing left. It doesn't shout, it whispers, but it's persistent. It keeps asking, even when you try to drown it out with productivity, distraction, or noise. Rogers called this the incongruence between the self and the self-concept. In simpler terms, it's the split between who you actually are and who you've learned to be, between your real feelings and the feelings you're allowed to show, between your true desires and the desires you've been told are acceptable. And when that split gets too wide, when you've spent too long ignoring what's real in favor of what's safe or expected or approved, something inside you starts to shut down. Not dramatically, not all at once, just quietly, slowly, until one day you realize you don't even know what you want anymore. You don't know what you feel. You don't know who you are underneath all the roles you've been playing. Even your preferences start to feel borrowed. That's emotional exhaustion, and it doesn't come from doing too much. It comes from being too little of yourself. Think about it. How much of your day is spent being authentic, not performing, not managing, not editing yourself to fit the room, just being? How much of your life is built around what you actually feel versus what you think you should feel? How many of your relationships are based on who you really are versus who you've learned to be in order to be loved, to be accepted, to be safe? If you're honest, the answer is probably uncomfortable. And that discomfort isn't something to run from. It's information. It's the beginning of awareness. Because you can't close the gap you refuse to see. And sometimes the first sign that you're ready for something more real is simply this. You're tired of living half present in your own life. Because most of us learned very early that being ourselves wasn't quite enough. That our real feelings were too much or not enough. That our true thoughts were unacceptable. That our authentic desires were selfish or wrong or inconvenient. So we adapted. We learned to read the room. We learned to mirror. We learned to become what was needed. And in the process, we learned to abandon ourselves. Rogers believed that this abandonment is the root of most psychological pain. Not trauma in the dramatic sense, though that matters too, but the slow, repeated experience of being told, subtly or overtly, that who you are is not okay, that you need to be different, better, quieter, stronger, softer, more, less. Over time, those messages become internal. You don't just hear them from others, you start repeating them to yourself, and so you split. You create a version of yourself that works, that gets approval, that keeps the peace, that earns love, and you push the real you down, somewhere deep and quiet, where it won't cause problems. You become skilled at anticipating expectations, at editing your reactions before they surface. You become competent at survival, but disconnected from authenticity. For a while, it works. You function. You succeed, even. You build a life that looks good from the outside. But inside, you're running on empty. Because you're not living your life. You're living the life you think you're supposed to live. And there's nothing more exhausting than that. The energy it takes to maintain that split is constant, invisible, and draining. If this resonates with you, if you've felt this quiet heaviness, this sense of being lost in your own life, I want you to know you're not alone. And if what I'm saying feels true, even uncomfortably true, consider staying with this. Subscribe if you haven't yet. There's more here, more that might help you make sense of what you've been feeling. Rogers worked with thousands of people who felt this way, people who came to him not because they were broken, but because they were tired of pretending, tired of performing, tired of living at a distance from themselves. And what he found, over and over again, was that the exhaustion wasn't the problem, it was the signal. It was the part of them that refused to disappear completely, the part that was still fighting, even quietly, to be seen, to be heard, to be real. He called it the actualizing tendency, the idea that every human being has an intrinsic drive toward growth, toward wholeness, toward becoming more fully themselves. Not a better version, not a fixed version, just a more honest version, a version that doesn't have to hide. But here's the thing, that drive doesn't go away just because you ignore it. It doesn't disappear just because you've learned to live without it. It just goes underground, and when it does, it shows up as exhaustion, as numbness, as that quiet, persistent feeling that something is wrong, even when everything looks right. You might not be able to name it. You might not even realize it's there, but your body knows. Your emotions know. That heaviness you feel, that's not weakness. That's your system telling you that you're living out of alignment, that the life you're living and the person you actually are have drifted too far apart. And the longer that gap exists, the more tired you become. Not because you're doing too much, but because you're being too little. Because holding back your truth, day after day, requires effort. Because silencing your needs creates tension. Because denying your own experience fragments your energy. So what do? How do you come back? How do you stop being exhausted by your own existence? Rogers would say the first step is the hardest one. And it's not about doing anything. It's about stopping. Stopping the performance. Stopping the pretending. Stopping the constant monitoring of how you're being perceived and whether you're doing it right. It's about stepping out of that invisible spotlight you've been standing under for years. The one where every word, every reaction, every choice is evaluated before it's even fully felt. It's about turning inward and asking a question most of us are terrified to ask. What do I actually feel right now? Not what you should feel. Not what makes sense to feel. Not what's reasonable or fair or logical. What do you actually feel? Is it anger? Is it grief? Is it resentment you've been labeling as patience? Is it loneliness you've been disguising as independence? To ask that question sincerely is to risk discovering that parts of you have been unheard for a very long time. And then, even harder, what do I actually want? Not what you're supposed to want. Not what would make others happy. Not what fits the image you've built. What do you want? If no one were watching, if no one were judging, if no one were depending on you to stay the same, what direction would your life lean toward? Most people can list responsibilities. Few can name desires, because desire feels dangerous when you've built your identity around being reliable, agreeable, and strong. Most people can't answer that question because they've spent so long asking a different one. What should I want? And those two questions lead to completely different lives. Living from what should I want leads to achievement, to approval, to safety, but also to exhaustion, to disconnection, to that slow, quiet sense of dying inside while everything on the outside looks fine. It creates a life that photographs well but doesn't feel lived in, a life that earns praise but costs you your aliveness. Living from what do I actually want is scarier. It's messier. It doesn't come with a manual. It might disrupt relationships. It might challenge roles you've outgrown, but it leads to something else. Something Roger spent his whole life trying to describe. He called it becoming a person, not becoming successful, not becoming perfect, just becoming real, becoming congruent, becoming someone whose inner experience and outer expression begin to align. And that process, that slow return to yourself, doesn't start with big changes. It starts with small moments of honesty, moments where you let yourself feel what you feel without immediately trying to fix it or explain it away, moments where you say what you actually think instead of what sounds right, moments where you pause before automatically saying yes, moments where you notice your body tightening and choose to listen instead of override it. It starts with treating yourself the way Rogers believed every person deserves to be treated, with unconditional positive regard, not judgment, not criticism, not the constant evaluation of whether you're good enough, just acceptance, just presence, just the quiet, steady belief that who you are, exactly as you are, is enough, that your anger makes sense, that your sadness has a story, that your confusion is not weakness but information. That doesn't mean you stop growing. It doesn't mean you become complacent. It means you stop growing away from yourself and start growing toward yourself. You stop trying to become someone else's idea of who you should be and start becoming who you actually are. Growth stops being a performance and becomes a process of integration. And here's what happens when you do that. The exhaustion starts to lift. Not all at once, not overnight, but slowly. You start to feel something you maybe haven't felt in years. Energy. Not the manic, driven kind, but the quiet, steady kind that comes from living in alignment, from not having to perform, from not having to hide, from not constantly bracing yourself against your own truth. You start to feel like yourself again, or maybe for the first time, and that feeling is subtle at first. It's in the way you breathe a little deeper, in the way conversations feel less scripted, in the way silence becomes less threatening and more restorative, because emotional exhaustion isn't a life sentence. It's a wake-up call. It's your deepest self saying, I'm still here, I'm still real, and I'm not going away. It's the part of you that refused to disappear completely, even when you tried to silence it for the sake of harmony, success, or survival. Rogers believed that most people don't need to be fixed. They need to be met. They need someone or something to reflect back to them that what they're feeling is real, that it makes sense, that they're not broken for feeling it. And sometimes that someone has to be you learning to sit with yourself without immediately turning away. So if you're tired, not just in your body, but in your soul, I want you to hear this. You're not broken. You're not failing. You're not weak. You're just living too far from yourself. And that distance, that gap between who you are and who you've been trying to be, is exhausting. It takes enormous energy to sustain an identity that isn't rooted in your own truth, but you can close it, not by trying harder, not by doing more, but by doing less, by letting go of the version of yourself that was built to please, by letting go of the life that looks right but feels wrong, by making space, even just a little space, for the person you actually are, space to feel, space to question, space to change. It won't be easy. It might mean disappointing people. It might mean letting go of things you thought you needed. It might mean admitting that the life you built isn't the life you want. And that's terrifying, because identity feels like safety, even when it's suffocating. But the alternative is worse. The alternative is spending the rest of your life being tired, being numb, being half alive, existing in a constant low-grade tension between who you are and who you pretend to be. Rogers once said that the curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. Not before, not by forcing, but by accepting, by being honest, by letting yourself be real. Change rooted in self-rejection creates more fragmentation. Change rooted in self-acceptance creates integration. And maybe that's the permission you've been waiting for. Not to be better, not to be more, just to be honest, to stop pretending, to stop performing, to stop living at a distance from your own life, to reclaim the parts of you that were set aside in order to belong. You're allowed to be tired. You're allowed to admit it. You're allowed to stop. You're allowed to rest. Not just your body, but your whole self. The part of you that's been working so hard to be acceptable, to be safe, to be enough. You're already enough. You always were. The exhaustion came from forgetting that, from believing that who you are wasn't quite right, that you needed to be someone else, that love and belonging were conditional. They're not. Not the real kind. The real kind doesn't ask you to disappear. It asks you to show up fully honestly, as you are. And when you do, when you stop abandoning yourself, something shifts. The tiredness doesn't disappear entirely. Life is still life, but it changes shape. It stops being the heavy, relentless weight of pretending and becomes something lighter, something more bearable, something that feels, for the first time in a long time, like yours. So maybe the question isn't why am I so tired? Maybe the question is what part of me have I been ignoring? What part of me have I pushed down, hidden away, abandoned in order to be acceptable? And maybe the answer to that question is the beginning of something. Not a solution, not a fix, but a return. A slow, quiet return to yourself, to the person you were before you learned to be someone else, to the life you want, not the life you think you should want. That's not easy, but it's real. And after years of living in performance, in pretense, in exhaustion, real might be exactly what you need. You don't have to keep carrying this alone. You don't have to keep pretending you're fine. You don't have to keep living a life that exhausts you just by existing. You're allowed to come home, to yourself, to the truth, to the quiet, steady presence of who you actually are. And maybe that's not the answer you were looking for. Maybe you wanted steps. Maybe you wanted a plan. But the truth is, becoming yourself isn't a project. It's a practice. It's a slow, ongoing choice to stop abandoning who you are in favor of who you think you should be. It's the choice to be tired of pretending more than you're tired of living. And when you make that choice, when you start to close the gap between your real self and the self you show the world, the exhaustion starts to lift. Not because life gets easier, but because you stop fighting yourself. You stop living at war with your own existence. And in that space, in that quiet, honest space, you start to feel something you maybe thought was gone forever. You start to feel alive again.